Hi, I'm JR. I'm going to make a somewhat brief comment here, and you can read the article below the video if you'd like. There's a development in global economics right now where there's instability, and in many cases, governments have been surprised by decreasing tax revenues, and many other people have been surprised by decreasing tax revenues. I am amongst many people who forecast the economic shift that's underway, who also forecast the reduction in tax revenues for sales taxes and income taxes, and also forecast certain reactions by governments, such as rescue and bailout programs, and forecast the long-term effects, if any, of those first stage of reactions. Just as a side note, in Japan in the 1990s and the last decade as well, there was an economic contraction, a decrease in tax revenues, a series of alterations made in government policies in terms of rescues and bailouts, and maybe Japan is a good place for me to share the information I have right here. I never really put all that together until just that moment. But the basic idea now is that I want to talk about a few different primary taxing systems and the implications that it has in regard to promoting economic prudence, because there are tax systems which specifically penalize economic prudence, and those are tax systems which tax income and capital gains. So when a certain kind of spending that is productive or profitable is taxed, that is capital gains taxes or income taxes. When all spending is taxed, that would be called a sales tax, or there are other terms like excise or value-added tax that could apply there. And then finally, there are taxes on ownership, such as property tax. When a company or individual hoards a large amount of assets and doesn't use those assets, doesn't develop the land or improve the land or utilize the land or tend the land or cultivate the land or put a building and otherwise do anything with the land. If they just buy the land and hold the land, that's not much economic activity. If someone buys and sells and buys and sells and buys and sells, that's a lot of economic activity. So it's transactions that are economic activity. Actually, creating something is also economic activity, but activity is economic activity. Buying something and just holding on to it and leaving it as it was when it was purchased, that's not much activity. That's hoarding. So we have tax structures that favor hoarding, that even reward hoarding, such as IRAs and 401ks. And then we have there are tax structures where there's no or little penalty of economic activity, such as if someone wants to start their own small business, which involves risk, which involves spending and hiring of people and possible innovation and competitiveness. If someone wants to be involved with a small business or a large business, that involves risk, and it also involves the possibility of profit. And if taxes are focused on penalizing profit, well, that's kind of weird. That's kind of odd that we would expect a tax system that specifically penalizes profit and economic prudence would promote economic prudence. Of course it penalizes economic prudence if you tax it. So instead of taxing economic prudence and favoring hoarding, as well as taxing spending, there could be a reduction, hypothetically, in the taxes that penalize spending and wise investment or income or capital gains, and instead of penalizing those things, encourage those things, or leave those things neither encouraged nor penalized specifically, and might discourage slightly or quite a bit, discourage hoarding of land, especially unused land. I don't have a lot else to say other than that. That's the basic idea. I do think of one thing, which is that because governments have been surprised by decreasing tax revenues with income taxes and sales taxes, it's also relevant to note that when taxing property, the amount of property or acreage in a given jurisdiction would be constant from year to year. So if there is a certain tax rate for commercial acreage and a certain tax rate for industrial and residential acreage, a tax authority would know exactly how much taxes it could expect, the limit of how much it would be. There would be no real question of, are we going to have more income than we expected or less income than we expected. So it would add security and certainty to tax revenues to increase property taxes as well as to decrease the widely fluctuating dependence on income taxes and sales taxes. So foreign and domestic investment would be encouraged by reducing income taxes. In the case of one particular U.S. president a few decades ago, the income tax rates were dropped, and there was actually an increase in the total revenues, even though the income tax rate was dropped. What happened, some argue, is that once income tax rates were dropped, foreign and domestic capitalists, rather than hoard their wealth, chose to invest more because they thought, well, we'll be able to keep the profits if we invest wisely. We'll be able to keep our profits. So there was more investment, more economic productivity, and actually more tax revenues by decreasing the tax rate on income taxes. Let's see. So again, in current circumstances, with many governments facing instability of their tax base, but also of their finances as a whole, insolvency and bankruptcy are things that sometimes are governments are forced to consider, or actually just simply can't pay their debts and they're forced into bankruptcy. In cases like that, governments might be all the more interested in decreasing their taxes that penalize economic productivity and increasing their taxes that promote stewardship of the land, so that only owners of the land who are going to use the land would be encouraged to own it. So it would increase transactions of land, and it would drop prices of land. However, it would attract, if that was part of a larger reform, that would attract a lot of investment. People would want to live there, not just because land is inexpensive, but because economic productivity, economic prudence is not penalized there, or not penalized as much as in other places. So that could attract people and investment, not just people in general, but wealthy people and people who are committed to prudently and responsibly invest and run businesses and start and maintain businesses that will be productive and competitive worldwide and locally and regionally. So it increases economic activity to reduce the penalties on economic activity, and to reduce tax favoritism of hoarding and even to penalize hoarding is something that governments might want to consider as governments are competing with each other to attract lenders to lend money to those governments. In other words, to buy the bonds of governments. So when governments want to borrow, they offer bonds, which means they promise to repay at a certain amount of interest. That is, they're trying to borrow money. So if governments want to be considered reliable and creditworthy in terms of keeping their promises on their bonds, then they might want to increase taxes that are predictable and reasonable and viable and sustainable, rather than taxes like sales taxes and income taxes that can widely fluctuate in the actual revenues and also that might discourage economic activity, might discourage economic productivity, economic prudence, and competitiveness. So that's the basic idea. Thank you for listening. If you have questions or comments, please feel free to share them with me.